Welcome back to this week's lecture, and this week we're going to look at World War I and some Asian imperialism, which will be on the next lecture. What I want to do today is just look at some of the roots of World War I, look at a few things that were happening during that time period, and take a closer look at what happened after World War I, especially after the peace treaty was signed. Okay, if you remember from a few weeks ago, we talked about the creation of Germany and how it was created at Versailles, which of course is in France, and how France had to give up a bit of territory and then pay this war indemnity. So they were not happy with this whole thing. And by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, Germany is really an economic power of Europe. And this made a lot of countries nervous, especially England and in particular France. So what they end up doing is creating treaties with each other to make sure that Germany doesn't rise up and take over more territory. You can look at the bottom of this. This treaty that was signed was called the Triple Entente. And originally this was just France and Russia, which is sort of an odd combination because France is one of the most liberal parts of Europe and Russia is one of the most conservative, but they're both worried about Germany. And so they signed this treaty, and what the treaty essentially said is that if Russia is attacked, then France has to attack Germany. Or if Germany attacks France, then Russia has to attack Germany. Later, England is involved with this Triple Entente. In the beginning, England didn't want to get involved because England had been a little separate from the continent for a very long time, and it wasn't really interested in getting involved in a war. But it too was worried about Germany, so they joined in on this. Of course, Germany didn't like this because Germany is in a position where it's surrounded by enemies. And if it ever had to go to war, ultimately it'd have to fight a two-front war. So it'd probably be fighting with France and Russia. So what Germany does is the same thing that France and Russia did and England. They decide to make a peace treaty or a treaty with their friends, and Germany chose Austria and Italy. Now, neither one of these countries had a very strong military, but there wasn't too much that Germany could do about it. So what they end up doing is signing this treaty, and again, it's the same thing. If Russia attacked Austria, Germany and Italy would have to come to their defense. And I hope what you can see through all of this is that these type of treaties really set up a trigger for what could be a much larger war than just a regional area. And of course, this is exactly what happened at the beginning of World War I. Part of Germany's plan for fighting a possible war in the future was something called the Schlieffen Plan. This plan said essentially that if a war had started, Germany was going to attack France first and then swing through and attack Russia. And it would have to swing through neutral Belgium. And Germany was really hoping that if it ever had to do this, England wouldn't care. So the Schlieffen Plan said that Germany would sweep through Belgium, attack France, and take that fairly quickly. And before the Russians could mobilize, the Germans would sweep their troops through Germany and then attack Russia. So that's the Schlieffen Plan. As we'll see, they actually put it into place, but it doesn't quite work out like they want it to. You have a couple of factors that really help start World War I. And one of these is national pride, where we already talked about how France had lost the Franco-Prussian War, and so they wanted that territory back and they wanted to regain some of that sense of being powerful. You've got the Russian and the Ottoman Empire too, so don't forget them. Russia in particular was weakened in a war with Japan and was humiliated, and so they wanted to bring back their national pride as well. We talked about imperialism. You've got some conflicts happening between Germany and Britain in Africa where they both want close to the same territory. And then adding to all of this, you have these ethnic groups that really want their freedom. So they start stirring up things and it ultimately leads to the war. You also have economic factors where we mentioned briefly the Second Industrial Revolution. You've got a period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where all of these countries are increasing their industrial output in terms of weapons. So I give you a list here: airplanes, machine guns, poisonous gas, artillery. They are building up their military. And then the one last thing that really leads to World War I are military tensions, especially in the Balkans. So you've got a couple of wars, the First Balkan War and the Second Balkan War, and these, at least the first one, is against the Ottoman Empire. So I list the countries. You've got Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria. They called themselves the Balkan League, and they fought against the Ottomans, and they end up winning. Now, in this particular war, Bulgaria ends up taking a huge amount of territory and not really sharing that with Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. And those countries did not like it. So as you can see, the very next year, there's a second Balkan War, where this time you've got Serbia, Greece, Romania, Montenegro. They go to war with Bulgaria. So in the end, Bulgaria loses this. And as I put it here on the scene, you get a stronger Serbia from this. And Serbia had always, or I'm sorry, Russia had always backed Serbia in a lot of things. You've got a weaker Bulgaria, and I put here, you have an angry Austria-Hungary because they weren't allowed to get involved in this fighting, mostly because Russia was threatening them. So you didn't want Russia getting involved in this, and you didn't want Austria-Hungary getting involved because it could trigger those alliances. So those are the setup to World War I. You've got national pride, you've got economic issues that are happening in terms of industrialization and production of weapons, and military tensions. Okay, now we can talk about the beginning of the war. So this started in late June 1914, where you've got a Serbian named Prinčep, who ended up assassinating the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne, and his name was Archduke Francis Ferdinand. This obviously did not make Austria-Hungary very happy. And what they ended up doing is giving Austria-Hungary a whole series of ultimatums. And these ultimatums really were something that Serbia could not accept. For example, what it said was Austria-Hungary would control the press in Serbia, and that no one could write anything bad against the Austria-Hungary throne or the government. So it's things like that that Serbia could not accept. And no big surprise, a month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia because Serbia wouldn't accept the ultimatum. So now think back to all those alliances. You've got Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Now, Serbia was really allied to Russia. And Germany and Russia were worried about this because they knew what those treaties stated. So you've got lots of communication happening between Germany and Russia just before the beginning of August 1914, and it doesn't work. So on August 1st, 1914, you've got Germany declaring war on Russia. And then the whole series of these alliances get triggered. So Germany declares war on France on August 3rd. So very quickly, from the assassination of the heir to the Austrian-Hungary throne, which was end of June, to the very beginning of August, you've got the triggers that start the war. And once the war started, this is called a world war for the obvious reason that most of the world was involved with this. And what I've given you here is sort of the major powers. So you've got the Allies, France, England, Russia, and then the typical countries, Serbia, Romania, and Belgium that we've talked about. You've got the Central Powers, the ones we already talked about as well, Germany, Austria, Italy, Bulgaria, and interestingly enough, the Ottoman Empire took the side of Germany. Not everyone is fighting at this point. So you've got various countries that are neutral, including the United States. And one thing I should tell you here is that even though Italy starts on the side of Germany, almost a year into the war, or not quite a year, they switch sides. And mostly they switch sides because the Allies promised them land. They promised them that they would get some land in Austria-Hungary if they switched sides, and when they won the war, they would get that. So Italy decided to leave the Central Powers and join the Allied powers. Here you're looking at a pretty typical picture of the beginning of the war, where you've got the soldiers nice and happy, you've got women coming out and greeting the soldiers and wishing them good luck. This happened on both sides. Both sides were happy to fight. And another thing that made them sort of happy is that both sides seemed to think that this war would be done by Christmas 1914. And as we'll see, they were in for a big shock because it doesn't end until 1918. I had mentioned just a bit ago that the US was remaining neutral in all of this. And the president during this time was named Wilson. And there was a debate in the US on which side the US should be on if a war started. As you can see here, many of the cabinet members were pro-British, but not all of them. And of course, there was a very large German population in the United States. But if you look at other things, there were stronger economic ties to England. And what you see is that once the war started, England and France started to ask the US for support. Now, the US had to be careful here because they were neutral. They weren't choosing a side. But the United States ends up giving supplies to England and France, and they were also starting to back US loans. Now, there's a few things that almost got the United States into the war, and that was the fact that Germany was doing sort of undeclared attacks on tourist ships. And so what I mean by undeclared is that normally what would happen in a war is that if you're in two ships, one ship would say, I'm about to attack you, and then it would attack. But the new technology of the submarine bypassed all of that. So Germany started sinking tourist ships, and one was the Lusitania. After it was sunk, you've got about 1,200 people end up dying on this, including a number of Americans. And the American government bitterly complained to Germany, and Germany promised that it would not attack tourist ships again, which of course did not happen, but that was their promise. By 1916, the US can see the writing on the wall, and the US starts ramping up its industrial output of weapons. So as I put here, it started a war economy. Now, President Wilson knew his history, and he could see the end of the war, and what he hoped was that at the end of the war, you would have something called peace without victory, where you've got the winners not declared as winners and the losers not declared as losers, so that you wouldn't get these tensions that you get, especially after the Franco-Prussian War, between France and Prussia, which created Germany. So he wanted something called peace without victory. As we'll see, he doesn't quite get that. Now we've got the start of the war. So it starts in August 1914, and sure enough, the Germans start the Schlieffen Plan. So they sweep through neutral Belgium, and by September, so less than a month, they were already threatening Paris. So the Schlieffen Plan, at least according to the first part of the war, ended up working. Now, what's really interesting is that that plan didn't quite work again, because the idea is that Germany would sweep through Belgium, capture France, and then sweep through Germany with its German troops, and then attack Russia before it got mobilized. Russia, however, was mobilized, and they got ready much faster than the Germans had expected. So they had to essentially fight a two-front war, which is what they were really worried about. However, you do have the Russians making inroads at the very beginning, but it doesn't last very long. So in the first month of the war, you've got Germany capturing 100,000 Russian soldiers. And this is really the last time that you've got Russians at least fighting on German soil. The Russians and the Germans keep fighting. Now, one of the reasons why the Schlieffen Plan didn't work is that you've got the Germans sweeping through Belgium and attacking France. They get very close to Paris, as we just talked about. However, then both sides dug in. And this is literally digging in. They ended up digging these ditches or trenches and fighting in those. And this is something called trench warfare, where you dig a ditch and then you stand in that ditch and you do all the fighting. And I've got a few scenes here showing you what trench warfare looks like. So you've got the trench warfare. What starts happening, though, is that both sides get very close to each other. And the area in between is called no man's land. And what they ended up doing is wrapping hundreds of miles of barbed wire through this no man's land. And then the way that you would fight is that the general would say, go, and you would have to jump out of your trench. jump across the barbed wire, or have a group of cutters cut the barbed wire, and then fight with the other side. And it was usually just a big bloodbath because the other side would stay in their trench and just shoot from there. This trench fighting also led to something called shell shock. It's because men used to spend months and months in these trenches fighting, and of course they're dirty, and it's wet because it was raining, and it's cold, and you would be fired on continually. So it led to a psychological condition called shell shock. Now, after lots of men started getting this, they reduced the time that people were actually fighting in the trenches, but it was a real serious health issue. If you remember from last week, we talked about the Second Industrial Revolution and the development of ammonia gas, which is used in farming. Some people took that gas and ended up using that in trench warfare, where they would make canisters of mustard gas and lob it into the trenches, and the gas was heavier than air, so it would sink in the trenches and attack people like that. Here you're looking at a famous photo of some English soldiers, and when this poisonous gas touched you, you would breathe it in. And it was called mustard gas because it was extremely hot, but not temperature hot, but feeling hot. And what it would do is it would blister the inside of the lungs, the nose, the mouth, and it was also attack the eyes. So, and when your eyes are attacked, you go blind, and there's no way of getting your sight back. So after this war, they made poisonous gas illegal to use in warfare. As the war began to bog down, the Allies decided that they had to do something different. And so what they ended up doing is attacking the Germany, Austria, and almost Italy. Italy's about to leave this side, to attack them from behind. And what they ended up doing is planning to attack them at Gallipoli, which is just in the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the map, it's right where it says Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. It's the place where the two meet, and that's near Gallipoli. So what they ended up doing is taking lots and lots of troops, especially from Australia and New Zealand, shipping them there, and then attacking the beaches at Gallipoli. The problem with fighting here is that you have a nice smooth beach, but then you've got a very steep series of hills that these Australians and New Zealanders had to fight up. And of course, that's a really bad way to fight. And sure enough, it was just a disaster. And as I put here, over 500,000 Australians and New Zealanders died in this series of battles at Gallipoli, and the whole thing was just a bad planning from the very beginning. I don't really want to talk about very many of the battles, but there's one in particular I do want to mention. It's at the French fortress of Verdun. And the Germans were getting ready to make a big push, and the French general named Pétain gave his very famous statement saying they shall not pass. And so what he did was he dug a lot of the troops in, and of course the Germans came in and they dug themselves in too. And in a very short period of time, you've got hundreds of thousands of people dead fighting over this particular fortress. So I just give you here a few of the statistics. So about 350,000 dead from France, about 330,000 dead from Germany. In the end of the fighting over Verdun, you've got over 1 million people who were killed at this particular place. And as I put here, the Allies made inroads about 6 miles into German-held territory. So we've got 1 million dead for 6 miles. By the time everyone is involved in this fighting, you've got about 24 countries involved in this. And of course, this is why it's called a world war. Part of the other reason why the whole world was involved in this is because of the colonialization process that we talked about in terms of imperialism. So you've got the British in South Africa. They're using British troops and African troops to fight against German troops and Africans who were in German territory. So you've got fighting happening all over. You also have other areas which decide that this fighting is a good time to get their own freedom. So you've got Ireland trying to revolt against English rule in 1916, and it was put down pretty heavily, but you see examples of this throughout the war where these large countries are busy fighting somewhere else, and ethnic groups or places like Ireland want to get their freedom and think that that was a good time to do it. Countries who were fighting start to limit the rights of their citizens. And this is especially the case in England, where laws were passed where people could not say anything bad about the English government. You also find this in the United States too. One interesting thing about World War I is that you find women starting to work in large numbers in these military factories because the men are out fighting. This will repeat again in World War II, and I'll try and remember to mention that. No big surprise, you've got food shortages. You've got all this fighting, you've got all these trenches being dug, you've got all these weapons being lobbed at people, ultimately hitting the ground, causing lots of devastation, and people start to starve. So it causes some serious problems for Europe in particular. And as we'll talk about at the end of World War I, you get this devastating flu, and it's partly because so many people are starving and they're sick, the war ends, and the flu shows up. So far, we haven't really talked about the United States because they've been neutral. And they were giving supplies to the Allies, and they started doing some loans. But the thing that really got the United States to get involved in the war was a telegram. And it's called the Zimmerman telegram, and it was sent from Germany to Mexico. And I've given you a tag here. You can actually read the whole thing because I don't know if you can read it on the screen. But what this telegram said is Germany promised that if Mexico got involved in the war and attacked the United States, that when the war was over, Germany would give back all of the southwest of the United States to Mexico. So we didn't really talk about this, but in the 1840s, the United States conquered a bunch of land like California, Utah, Arizona, and so on that belonged to Mexico. It now became United States territory. So what Germany was saying to Mexico is that if they attack the United States, and if they win, or if Germany wins, Mexico is going to get all of this back. Now, England found this telegram, and of course they sent it to the United States, and the United States was not very happy about all of this. And it started to make them think that they have to really get involved in this war before it got too serious. So the Zimmerman telegram was sent in January 1917, and by April 1917, the U.S. is involved in the war. And you've got about 20 million people registering to fight in this war. The other thing that really made a big difference in the outcome of the war was that the U.S. opened up its banking system. And so it allowed the Allies to borrow cash, and it made a really big difference. Now, we'll see in just a bit, it does cause some problems because the financial capital of the world before this was London. After the war, the financial capital really gets transferred to New York City, and we'll talk about all the things that happened in terms of the Great Depression and the problems with the stock market in New York affecting the entire world. But right now, the U.S. gets involved. It has all these millions of men who are about to be sent over, and the banking system is opened up. So don't forget that Russia was involved in all of this on the side of France and England. Now in 1917, you've got a revolution, and this was led by Lenin, and his political party was called the Bolshevik. So they overthrow the government, and this happened at a time when Germany was making great inroads into Russian territory. So they're pushing up further north, and the Russians are losing a bunch of territory. So what ends up happening without the permission of Lenin is that the Bolshevik Party contacted the Germans and tried to make a peace treaty. And this proposed peace treaty said that the Germans had to stop fighting, they had to go back home and leave Russia alone. Now, of course, Germany didn't accept this, and Germany imposed a pretty serious peace treaty on it, which we'll talk about in the next scene. And Lenin was furious when he found out that his political party was involved in this peace treaty, which took away a huge chunk of Russian territory and essentially took Russia out of the war, because that was the deal with the peace treaty. Russia had to stop fighting, and that's essentially what they did. The peace treaty that was signed is called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And as you can see here, what it ended up doing is giving a giant chunk of Russian territory to the Germans. And a huge chunk of the Russian population lived in this area. So about a fourth of the entire population was put under German control. They lost all the agricultural land. This is also a very rich area for natural resources for Russia. So they end up losing half of their manufacturing capability in terms of coal and iron. So this is a great win for Germany, terrible loss for Russia. And the Allies weren't very happy either when Russia signed this treaty because, again, it took them out of the war. And France and England and the United States now really need the Russians, to be fighting on that side of Germany. And this ultimately leads to a deep separation between Russia and the rest of Europe. By the beginning of 1918, the Allies really knew that they were going to win this war, and President Wilson issues a very important document called the 14 Points. And I know there's a lot of text here. You can certainly stop the video and read that. I will also give you a tag to his 14 points so you can read these things. But what he was thinking about was the end of the war. And remember his idea of peace without victory. That's really what he was hoping for. So one of the first points, or the first point, is that there shouldn't be any of these secret treaties, which everyone knew had really triggered this war. And then it goes on. I mean, at point number 8, if you remember the Franco-Prussian War, where France got some territory taken away from that territory had to be restored. And so what it was doing is giving that territory back to France, and of course Germany losing this. President Wilson also wanted to create something called the League of Nations. Now this ends up getting created, but the U.S. doesn't join. But the idea behind it, again, it's a route to our United Nations. It's a place where all the nations can get together, talk about their problems before they start fighting. So his 14 points were really important. But as we'll see, many of them were not adopted after the war. World War I ended on a very easy date to remember, so it's November 11th at 11 a.m. So the 11th month, 11th day, 11th a.m., 1918. We sort of celebrate this as Veterans Day. Lots of other countries, especially Europe, Australia and New Zealand, it is a really big, solemn event. But anyway, at the end of the war, they signed something called the Treaty of Versailles. And I will give you a tag where you can actually read as much of the treaty as you want to. But it had a war guilt clause. Now remember, this was put on the losers of a war. So Germany lost the war. What it said is Germany had to accept that it started the war, and it's the whole reason why it was fought. Germany also had to pay a massive, massive war reparation. Now, this is something that France had to pay, if you remember the Franco-Prussian War, so they're really punishing Germany for this. The Treaty of Versailles, again, hundreds of pages long, but another important part is that the German military had to be reduced. It had to essentially get rid of most of its navy and get rid of its air force. And then, of course, what it had to do is give back all of that territory that it had taken, and Poland would once again be recreated. So this Treaty of Versailles is an interesting after history because lots of scholars debate about whether the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh and leads to World War II, or that it really wasn't, and scholars are making it out to be worse than it was. Maybe what I'll do is I will pop up an article on our course material, and you can read the debates that are happening about this Treaty of Versailles. But anyway, it's what was signed at the end of World War I. It stopped the war. Germany had to pay back a massive reparation and give back all of the territory that it had taken. In the end, the war was amazingly devastating. So it was supposed to be the war that ended all war, and in the end, you got about 8 million killed, over 20 million injured. Now, that is pretty awful. But soon after the war ended, you get this flu epidemic. So it's called the influenza epidemic. Started in 1918, which was the year that the war officially ended, lasted for really more than 1919. But in the end, it killed way more than the war actually did. And if you remember, we talked about how there was lots of starvation and things. So people were sick in general, and this flu spread around the world. So lots of people ended up dying from it. One of the outcomes of the war, of course, you've got collapsed countries. So Germany was collapsed. Russia was taken over by the Germans and was having a pretty serious time after the war ended. You've got the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary ended up collapsing as well. Now, of course, you've got the war, pretty devastating. Lots of cities were damaged. Agriculture was devastated during this period. So Europe was going to have a pretty hard time recovering from all of this. And I mentioned just a little bit earlier when the United States opened up its banking system that London was the financial capital before World War I, but after New York becomes an international center for finance. And once again, we will soon talk about how this leads to lots of problems for the rest of the world, especially with the Great Depression.